virtual forum on the theme of global and Gulf regional strategies for security and justice in an age of uncertainty. I am Richard Ponzio, Director of Stimson's Just Security 2020 program, and along with my colleagues and our ICG partner, Richard Gowan, we're thrilled and thankful for the participation of so many of you from literally around the world. Before the other Richard introduces our keynote speaker, Sheikha Alia, from the permanent mission of Qatar to the United Nations, who will get things started, followed by our moderated roundtable with a truly world-class group of experts, let me briefly share my program's take on our timely theme for this session. Last year, my Stimson colleagues and I were honored to collaborate with our partners in Doha on the inaugural Doha Forum report on reimagining governance in a multipolar world, which presents 10 fundamental principles for strengthened governance and collective action across borders. Of particular relevance to today's conversation on governance at both the global and regional levels are the principles of 1, resolving conflicts peacefully through dialogue, 2, upholding international law, and 3, respecting the sovereign equality of all states. At the core of our recommendations is a fundamental concern for ensuring that neither justice nor security imperatives are neglected by international policymakers. Striking a proper balance between principles of justice and security has become even more urgent with the onset of the COVID-19 crisis and its devastating social and economic effects afflicting millions of people worldwide. With the hope of contributing useful analysis and recommendations for strengthening global and regional governance and collective action, especially as the UN marks its 75th anniversary this year and the Gulf Cooperation Council nears its 40th anniversary next year, we very much welcome everybody's participation in today's global conversation. And at the conclusion of both the keynote address and virtual roundtable discussion, we will welcome each of you to engage our panelists via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. So please feel free to contribute your questions anytime during this program. Again, the Q&A button, bottom of your screen. Include your name and where you are coming from. And also, please participate via Twitter. You have to have an event with Twitter. So we're using the hashtag JustSec or hashtag JUSTSEC as one word. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our partner, Richard Gowan, who's very well known as a top expert in UN circles and directs the United Nations Office for the International Crisis Group. And please kindly click on the link in the chat box for the bios of all of our speakers today. Over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I look forward to hearing from many other speakers not called Richard during this excellent discussion. Crisis Group is delighted to be co-sponsoring this event with the Stimson Center. Crisis Group, as you know, has a long history of work on conflicts and issues in the Middle East, led by our president, Rob Malley, and our Middle East director, Joost Hilterman. We recently published a very extensive report, which Joost led on collective security arrangements in the Middle East and how they could be developed. But as you say, I'm here in my capacity as Crisis Group's UN director to introduce Ambassador Al-Thani, Sheikha Alia, in a few words. Crisis Group is proud to be a long-standing partner of the Qatari mission here in New York, and we have held many very interesting debates together. So it's a pleasure to introduce the ambassador, and I would say that you are about to hear from one of the most experienced and one of the most active senior members of the UN diplomatic corps. The ambassador has been posted in New York since 2013, but even before then, she was at the Qatari mission in Geneva as the deputy head of mission. While based here in New York, Sheikha Alia has focused on a really remarkable range of issues and resolutions in the General Assembly and other forums. She's covered issues ranging from autism to war crimes, to natural disasters and to human trafficking. And she is a go-to ambassador, I think, for other diplomats and also for UN officials who want to push challenging issues through the UN system with sensitivity and with success. And I think that's one reason why the ambassador is very busy at the moment. As Richard mentioned, she is one of the co-facilitators with her Swedish counterpart for the declaration celebrating the 75th anniversary of the UN this September. That declaration is, I think, still in the works, but we've seen some bootleg copies, if you will, and it's a strong and an extensive declaration of recommitment to the UN in a difficult time. The ambassador is also, again, as Richard mentioned, working on the commemoration of the Beijing conference on the status of women, the Beijing +25 declaration. And that hasn't stopped her working on other issues such as the protection of education in crisis situations. So there is no one better, I think, to tell us about the state of the UN today. Sadly, everything in the UN world is now virtual, but that does mean that those of us based in New York can speak more easily, perhaps, to those in Washington and elsewhere. So I'm delighted and honored to hand over to Ambassador Al-Thani.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much for the kind words, much appreciated. And of course, I want to thank both the Stimson Center and International Crisis Group for inviting us today and putting together such a distinguished panel. I'm happy, of course, to get the ball rolling, as we say, to give you a hint on, of course, and a perspective on Qatar's point of view on the global and regional security and justice in age of uncertainty. Such a great topic that you have picked to start the discussion today. Distinguished guests, the question, of course, of security, justice, and the rule of law is a major concern for states and decision makers at the regional and global levels, for it is linked to the stability and sustainability of countries and prosperity of their people. There is therefore a nexus between achieving security in its various human dimensions and the existence of a security system that is based on justice and law. This close connection in turn shapes regional and international situations, as the state is the main stakeholder in international relations. The title for this dialogue is therefore both inspiring, of course, and significant, given present tensions and challenges worldwide, including notably, of course, the catastrophic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. More than any time in human history, we live in an interconnected world. Since the stability of international system depends largely on credible international institutions backed up by committed member states, it is worthy to recall the conditions that led to the establishment of the United Nations some 75 years ago, and to check whether the organization has been able to achieve the founder's vision of international peace and security, development, and human rights, and to learn the lesson from the past wars and human sufferings due to the pursuing of individualistic policies that lack respect for the sovereignty of states and for the will and choices of peoples, and for ignoring the rule of law and respect for human rights. So, where do we stand today in all of these efforts to promote greater global and regional security and justice? Has the international community learned sufficiently to avoid the recurrence of past tragedies? And are international institutions capable of deterring the behavior and bullying of some countries that jeopardize the stability and security of other nations and the prosperity of their people, thereby also threatening international peace and security? Distinguished participants, today, of course, marks the 3rd anniversary of the illegal and unlawful blockade that has been imposed on the state of Qatar by 4 well-known countries in the region. Why have the blockading countries targeted Qatar, which maintains moderate regional and global policies, whether in terms of hosting forums on international cooperations on issues as diverse as global trade, climate action, and building a peace and pioneering unique development approaches, and pushing the boundaries of human experiences in the arts, architecture, sports, and other important fields. How can the blockading countries simply disregard the principle and charter of the United Nations and international law, which affirms respect for sovereignty of states and the will of their people? Distinguished participants, the principles and goals of the United Nations constitute the basic pillars of the foreign policy of Qatar. The commitment of Qatar towards the United Nations is therefore a strategic choice, since the organization provides the main platform for global multilateral cooperation. The need for the UN is more urgent today than ever before, especially at a time when humanity is facing an unprecedented pandemic that tests our international leaders and institutions. It is in this spirit Qatar has continued to support multilateral action embodied by the United Nations system to enable it to advance international peace and security, human rights, sustainable development, and to strengthen the partnership to support the UN to foster peace, hope, and justice for all. Qatar is, of course, working to address the challenges facing our planet caused by climate change. For instance, this past September, His Highness the Emir of Qatar, during the UN Climate Action Summit in September 2019, announced an important contribution by Qatar of the amount of $100 million to support small island developing states and least developed states to deal with mitigate the effects of climate change and the environmental challenges, and to build the capacity of those countries to counter the effects of climate change. Qatar has also continued actively to participate in international efforts to combat terrorism and violent extremism, not only from the security approach, but as well through tools of education, science, and technology. We believe wholeheartedly in the good that can be achieved in reinvesting and modernizing our institution of global governance during UN 75th and beyond. At the regional level, Qatar has played a vital role in the establishment, of course, of the Gulf Cooperation Council since its inception in 1981, thus contributing to strengthening regional security and stability in the Gulf region and securing vital energy supplies to the whole world. But of course, on the eve of May 23rd, 2017, the meaning of unity within the Gulf Cooperation Council has been shattered into pieces by the first trigger of the orchestrated crisis, which is the state-sponsored cyber attack that targeted Qatar news agency by broadcasting fabricated information attributed to the leadership of the state of Qatar. The seriousness of the state-sponsored cyber attack lies in the fact that it took place days before the imposition of the illegal and unlawful blockade against the state of Qatar on June 5th, 2017. Which repercussions continue to plague our region's security and stability, and thus, of course, the opportunities for regional cooperation to face common challenges, as well as the violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms of thousands of people in the state of Qatar and other countries in the region. Nevertheless, Qatar has affirmed on all occasions its readiness to work with the GCC and other international bodies to resolve the persistent crisis through unconditioned dialogue, of course, respect for the sovereignty of Qatar, and the non-interference in its internal affairs. It has also expressed its full support for the commendable effort by His Highness the Emir of the State of Kuwait to resolve this crisis. On the legal front, we have taken the route of international law and filed several complaints in international courts and international forums. One example, of course, resorting to the International Court of Justice as the main judicial organ of the United Nations to protect the rights of Qatari citizens and residents adversely affected by the actions taken by the United Arab Emirates on June 5, 2017, that violated the UN Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Distinguished guests, after 3 years since it all began, we stand proud, of course, today of the successes achieved and the external partnership we have established with countries of the world with whom we share respect for human rights, the rule of law, and international cooperation. We are keen to continue, of course, our efforts on the path of progress. Unfortunately, there are well-known driving forces in our region that work to prevent such progress: the respect for human rights and the rule of law. But of course, change is inevitable. Today, the world faces an imminent threat affecting all countries, regardless of their size or scientific capabilities. By that I mean, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Eradicating the pandemic requires renewed cooperation among all countries and renouncing their outstanding differences. The threat of this pandemic poses to all of us should serve as a catalyst for rapprochement in our region, for seeking solutions to crises and tensions, and for facilitating access to humanitarian aid. In light of the pandemic, there is a need for heightened regional coordination and cooperation to address the threat. In support of this effort, of course, Qatar has provided significant assistance to countries affected by the pandemic and established urgent airlifts to transport relief and medical equipment to many countries in the region in the spirit of international cooperation in the face of this pandemic. Just yesterday, for example, at the Global Vaccine Summit held virtually in London, His Highness the Emir of Qatar announced a new pledge for the State of Qatar of the amount of $20 million in support of the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations for Gavi, the organization that has putting so much effort in creating the vaccine for the COVID-19 pandemic. His Highness, of course, also called upon the international community to work jointly to ensure fairness in providing the necessary medicines and vaccines and medical equipment to all countries to promote global readiness to confront this vicious virus. I would like to conclude, of course, by saying that Qatar believes strongly in the shared responsibility at the global level to face common challenges and threats together. Attempts to disrupt our contributions to the global and regional cooperation for greater security and justice for all only strengthens our resolve, as well as our commitment to and respect for international law and human rights. These firm beliefs are inspired by the values and principles of the founders of the State of Qatar and its present leaders. We seek to empower Qatar's citizens and to build new bridges to other countries for the betterment of humanity. And I would like to thank you again for this opportunity, and I will stop here, and I very much look forward to this very fruitful discussion today.
Thank you, Sheikha Alia, for your insightful keynote address, offering, as we just heard, national, regional, and global ways in which Qatar perceives and engages critical issues and challenges today at the intersection of global and regional security and justice. Now, to build on these rich leadoff remarks, I'm pleased to hand moderation over to our President Emeritus of the Stimson Center, Ellen Leibson, who is also Director of the Center for Security Policy Studies at the Schar School of Public Policy and Government at George Mason University. And again, the link to the bios of all of our expert panelists can be found in the Zoom chat box. And by clicking on the other button at the bottom of your webinar screen, the Q&A button, you can share your questions with the expert panelists. We're going to get to those at the top of the hour. And please kindly include your name and where you are coming from. The webinar floor is all yours, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thanks to Sheikha Alia for a really provocative and wonderful opening discussion. I think what we're going to try to do in our panel is explore the range of issues between the New York perspective or the global perspective on the future of the UN and global governance, but also use the Gulf region as a particularly important case and hopefully make some connections between conflict resolution efforts within the GCC or in other parts of the Middle East and as they relate to the UN system more broadly. I think one of the themes that has emerged in UN affairs over the decades is instead of seeing conflict resolution at the regional level somehow in competition with the UN, we try to look for the ways in which they complement or mutually reinforce and assist each other. So I hope we will be able to connect some of those dots in the conversation. As Richard said, we encourage all of the participants to look at the wonderful biographies of our distinguished panelists, but in the interest of time, I'd like to just move directly to our panel. So let me very quickly, Richard Gowan is now the UN Director at the International Crisis Group. He's been a very senior strategic analyst of UN and multilateral affairs. For many years, he and I share one connection, which is we were both weekly columnists for the World Politics Review. Dr. Masheed Ansari is Assistant Professor of Political Sociology at Qatar, previously was the head of their Survey Research Institute and has a distinguished academic, scholarly, and government career. Kirsten Fontenrose is currently directing the Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, previously served in government at the White House, at the Defense Department, and the State Department. We really are delighted to have a perspective, an authoritative perspective from the US government. And lastly, Dr. Abdullah Baobood, who's currently teaching in Singapore, but also is from Oman, I believe, and has a deep experience in looking at regional issues in the Middle East. So the plan is for me to pose questions to each of our panelists in a series, and then maybe do a second round of questions, but encourage them to comment on each other. So we'll try to make this as much of a dialogue or a conversation as we can. I'm going to start with Richard Gowan, and here we'll start with this kind of global perspective. On these themes of justice and security, there are only two of the many cosmic issues that the UN has to address and think about as it plans to commemorate its 75th anniversary. But you've been a longtime observer and sometimes critic of the UN system, and I wanted to give you a chance to give us a broad view as what's the mood in the run-up to the 75th anniversary? What do you see as some of the major challenges, sources of disagreement or friction as the world community thinks about setting kind of the goals and objectives of this to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the UN? So why don't you just give us, a broad view of what's the mood? What are some of the challenges and sources of division and friction among member states?
Well, of course, like everyone else on the planet, most UN diplomats spend most of their time nowadays struggling with Zoom and other webinar mechanisms. And I believe that even now, the French are hosting a Security Council meeting that is only in French, which is causing a great deal of heartache for those diplomats who don't speak the language. But to be more serious, while I think that Sheikha Alia's work on the UN 75 declaration has been positive and smooth, the overall diplomatic mood in New York is fairly bleak. And in fact, the COVID-19 crisis has actually highlighted some pretty deep-seated tensions that were already complicating diplomacy in the institution. I mean, for a decade, we've known that tensions between Russia and the US have been undermining the Security Council, and especially the Security Council's ability to work in the Middle East. But what we've seen in recent months, and especially around COVID, is a rapid increase in tensions between Chinese and US diplomats in New York. And that actually has come out both in the disputes over the World Health Organization, culminating with President Trump's boycott of the WHO, but also in disputes in the Security Council. And the Security Council cannot currently agree a resolution on the security implications of COVID-19 because of arguments between the US and China, and only the US and China, in fact, over whether that resolution should contain a reference to the WHO. So I fear that what we're seeing at the moment is at least 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council suffering a further deterioration of their relations. And as we come out of the COVID period, I think that is going to place great limits on what the Council can do globally, but also in situations specifically like Libya and Syria. The good news is, and primarily outside the Security Council, a lot of countries are saying, no, COVID is not a moment for division. It's a moment for greater multilateral cooperation. And we've seen that in discussions of vaccines. We've seen it in discussions of broader humanitarian cooperation around the pandemic. And countries like France, for example, have really been trying to push this agenda of cooperation over the last couple of months. But I don't think we can escape the fact that right at the moment, at the very heart of the UN, in the Security Council, big power relations are really threatening to deepen a lot of the problems the organization has been suffering for a while.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to turn now, we're going to sort of toggle back and forth between the totally global UN perspective and the Gulf, the specific dynamics in the Gulf. I wanted to ask Majid Ansari, how would you describe the state of play in the Gulf? And you can broaden it to other Middle Eastern countries. And are there prospects? Are you seeing any trends towards confidence building, trust building, security improvements, knowing what we know about some of the current sources of friction in the region? So over to Dr. Ansari, please.
Thank you, Ellen. Well, I think it's, I don't see any optimistic view that can be brought about from looking at the current situation in the GCC region, especially for a keyword that you have used there in your question, Ellen, which is trust. I think there's a major lack of trust in the region that was brought by the 2017 blockade of Qatar, but also of generally a disagreement on how to handle regional issues. Since 2010 and the Arab Spring, there's been a lot of disagreement between the countries of the GCC around how to deal with these regional uprisings and how to deal with the geostrategy of the region, if you will. And to add to that, we have the rift in the Gulf, the tensions with Iran, the situation in Yemen, in Libya. It's a growing pandemic of mistrust in the region. And I think one of the main things to think about now is when we have such a health pandemic like COVID-19, it raises a lot of questions about the vulnerability of the countries of the region to such an issue when there is very little communication, very little cooperation between countries in the region. Obviously, between Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, there has been a lot of collaboration over this issue and other issues in the region. But the rift between Qatar and UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, and Egypt, of course, has caused a lot of tension even over this topic. You can see some kind of, let's say, politicization of COVID-19 by the media outlets of various countries. We have seen attempts to even sabotage the good work that's happening internationally and the initiatives that are taking place by certain countries like Qatar and the region. So I think one main takeaway of this is that the mistrust in the region is not just a political issue that can be resolved on the tables of international organizations or regional organizations, which it hasn't been anyways for the foreseeable past. But it is actually a problem that has went a step more to affect even how people deal with these kind of political crisis. I mean, beforehand, there used to be a bit of a separation between the political elite and how these kinds of disagreements happen between them and what that means to their cooperation and to their dealing with each other in various capacities, and how it affects people themselves on the ground. Since families have been barred from meeting each other, fathers have been able to meet their children and vice versa since 2017. With this current crisis and with the COVID-19, we have seen even a deterioration of this cooperation and communication between peoples in the region. Just to end on one note, which is that for the people of the Gulf especially, since the 1980s, there was a new identity that was created, which is the GCC identity, the Gulf identity. The word we use is Khaliji. That word means a lot to my generation, especially the generation of the 80s, that grew up thinking of the Gulf as one region that is close to each other, different than others. It has its own cultural, its own religious, its own political identity that is represented even, for us who studied abroad. We form these GCC communities and caveats wherever we go. The current situation is very alarming because we have a new generation that's being brought up on near-sided patriotism, on very small-minded view of what the region means and what our relations to our brothers and sisters and to our extended families in the region is. And the main problem here is that transcends political disagreement into a social rift that can affect generations to come. And this is, in my opinion at least, the main problem that can result from this mistrust that's going in the region.
Thank you very much. That was very compelling. And I wonder if we can turn to Kirsten Fontenrose now. So I want to ask you kind of a two-part question. From an American interest perspective, since both your government experience and now that you're at the Atlantic Council, how does the blockade in particular, or the larger problem of mistrust in the region, affect American interests? Is the US able to, in any way, improve the environment? But based on Richard Gowan's opening question, I wonder if you'd also help our participants understand the Trump-era national security strategy that does pose a sort of new concept of geopolitics. To just refer to his discussion of friction among the US, Russia, and China, did that frame, in fact, your own work on the Middle East when you were at the White House? How would you connect that larger vision of American national security to the specific issues of the Gulf? Thank you.
Yes, to your second question first, it absolutely did frame our work. For instance, we were constantly arguing for continued US involvement, engagement, and attention to the Gulf and to the greater Middle East, because in the national security strategy written in 2017 and in the national defense strategy written in 2018, there's a focus on East Asia as the primary threat and Russia as the second threat. So for instance, the statement on the Middle East in the national security strategy commits the US to retain the necessary American military presence in the region to protect the United States and our allies from terrorist attacks and preserve a favorable regional balance of power. That's a direct quote. But the more strongly worded commitment regarding the Indo-Pacific is to maintain a forward military presence capable of deterring and, if necessary, defeating any adversary. Also a direct quote from the NSS. So those are two very different wordings, and they really speak to a greater attention and commitment to US involvement and resources in East Asia than to the region. So while we're working on it, we're constantly in this kind of back and forth with competing security requirements from all parts of the globe. Add to that you're dealing with Iran's presence in Venezuela and some other things, and you really have constrained resources. So then you pile onto that we're looking at the North Korea ballistic missile program, which is the only program listed in the NSS by name. The only country listed by name. Iran is not in there, and they've got things like a Hwasong 15 intercontinental ballistic missile that can fly 8,000 miles in a straight line. It could reach the US homeland. That is a much more imminent threat than what we see out of Iran or other adversaries. So naturally that gets the higher profile and more attention. And so for those of us arguing to continue in perpetuity the commitment to the Gulf, it's always a tough sell. It's not an impossible sell. And we make the argument that if you turn your back on the adversaries in the region, they grow. It's like an antibiotic you don't take long enough, and the disease grows back. So, and we're watching that continually with resurgence of extremist groups as one example, much less other kinds of state adversaries. So yes, this was a constant battle. I feel sometimes like our regional partners almost don't appreciate how far their diplomats and policymakers in the US government that have been working on the region forever really are going to great lengths to make sure that this we have to be tough on them sometimes, but we're also really fighting the good fight to keep the US involved. And it doesn't always look like that when you see the US through this lens of just the region. You have to kind of expand out to the greater aperture of US global commitments to really see what they're competing with. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Kirsten. And the last of our first round will be to Dr. Abdullah Babood. From your perspective, help us understand which principles of kind of regional and global cooperation, are most important. I mean, if you were able to advise leaders and saying, there's so many problems in the world, how do we kind of zoom in and focus on the ones where we might be able to actually have an impact? So, a very broad, a wide angle question for you of just give us your own thoughts on how you might develop your own academic and scholarly work on both strengthening both regional and global security issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, and good evening or good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's quite a loaded question, but I think the first principle that we have to take into consideration that we all live in this world together, and this planet is made of all of us, and we can either make it survive or we can destroy it. And the way to make it survive, and hopefully that's what people really want, is to actually work together and to cooperate together. So cooperation is obviously one of the most important principles I would expect. And on that, I would say, it has to be built on mutual respect and sanctity of the state and equality of the people and also of the countries, large or small. It has to be also based on international law and respect of international norms. I believe also that it has to be also based on prosperity and development, etc. And those can only be achieved if there was peace and security. So peace and security are, of course, the most important, if you like, prerequisite for economic development, for prosperity. I think human rights are also very important, and good governance. And of course, I can go on, respecting the environment and, respecting, of course, understanding that pandemics or climate change do not respect boundaries, and we are all here in this planet, and we can do something together. And also, we have to respect that there are always differences in opinions, and there are always differences in interest between countries and between people. And therefore, it is only possible that these differences are reconciled through dialogue and negotiations, and of course, trying to develop a trust as well, which is important between people and countries. So I think these are the common principles. I also subscribe to all the principles that has come in the EU 75, and of course the Stimson Center 10 principles as well. I think those are important principles to build on. And if I would just, Ellen, if you allow me to just go back to the region, and I would say that within the region, when I say the region, the Middle East and the Gulf, we lack some of these principles, unfortunately, and we also suffer from either greater powers trying to impose their will on us, and that's greater international powers, or regional powers trying to do the same. And unfortunately, we lack any kind of regional mechanism where we can have negotiations, dialogue, conflict resolution, confidence building measures. All of these are lacking in the region. And I don't see this is, nothing has been changed. We have seen this, throughout the last few decades. And look at the many conflicts that the region has gone through, and it is going through now. I mean, and in the Gulf, of course, we live in one can say, an island of prosperity, but we are also surrounded by a sea of hungry and angry people around us. You look around us, and it's all, it's all turmoil everywhere, and that is now creeping towards us, towards the Gulf states, if our neighbors are not safe. So we have to respect our neighbors. We have to also help them to develop. And I think this can only be done through building regional institutions that are based on, that are rule-based and they are respected. And to this extent, I would, go and say, well, the GCC was an attempt to do that. But unfortunately, with this crisis, it wasn't respected. The rules were not respected. The rules were broken in this crisis. One of the rules is this, that this institution was built on the interconnectivity of the people. And the fact that they share the same roots, the same families, the same tribes, the same destiny. And there are, of course, institutions within the GCC, and there are, of course, a charter that was written, and agreements that were signed. And one of the most celebrated agreements is the Common Market Agreement, which calls for a free flow of people, capital, and goods. And of course, this crisis destroyed that agreement. And not only it did destroy it, but also it did not respect the decision making. The blockade, of course, goes against the letter and the spirit of the agreement, and of course of the GCC itself. But it did not go to the Supreme Council of the GCC to decide. It was decided outside GCC mechanisms, which of course, does destroy trust, and not only amongst member states, but also amongst the people. How can we build and sign agreements and then not respect them, and not respect the decision making that was that we have agreed to? So I think trust and respect of regional agreements, of international law, of regional laws, are of course one of the most important things. And I think you want me to stop here, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. But you've raised some very important themes, and I take from several of the comments that we have to think about conflict resolution and peace building, not just at the formal level of institutions and governments, but how much it affects human society and patterns of interaction that are less official, but actually do contribute profoundly to perceptions of security. Certainly, this whole question of security and justice is playing out in very tragic form in the United States right now, and that people are taking power into the streets because they don't think the formal institutions have served them well. So for a second round of questions, I do want to dig in a bit on these issues of what institutions or approaches are likely to be more effective. But I also want to encourage you, I have a question for each of you, but please jump in and comment on what you've heard so far. Don't be limited by my specific question, but if you want to react or respond to anything that the other speakers have said, that would be just fine. So Richard Gowan, back to you. It does seem to me that one of the gradual changes that's happened in the UN system is greater receptivity to non-government inputs or contributions. So, you've represented a number of civil society organizations that have really tried to have a big impact on how the UN thinks and what ideas that may be circulating among within the UN as an intergovernmental institution, but one in which global civil society wants to have a voice and can have a voice. So I wonder if you just update us on what's the state of play? How do civil society organizations actually get their voice heard in the UN system? Do you think it's working? Do you think there are additional steps that need to be taken to make sure that this is not just a conversation among, formal government entities, but it represents global civil society as well?
Well, I mean, as you say, I've worked on the UN for about 15 years. I'm not sure I want to take responsibility for how badly the UN has performed during many of those 15 years, to be honest. But I think it is fair to say that the UN, actually to a significantly greater extent than some other organizations such as NATO, does bring civil society organizations into its discussions. And that ranges from discussions of peacekeeping to the women, peace and security agenda to development. And I think that has been one of the UN's strengths, that, you know, it has a reputation as being a big, slow-moving bureaucracy. But in reality, actually, UN officials do listen to outside ideas. And that is, I think, of a special importance at a moment like now, when the member states are debating the future of the organization. And I see a difference between the work that Ambassador Al-Thani is doing, putting together a statement of consensus between the member states on the role of the UN, and what civil society organizations are doing in terms of staking out possible reforms for the UN going forward. I think at the member state level, we need a preservationist agenda. We need to ensure that member states keep on recommitting to much of the good work that the UN does on things like the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think there's been some success on that track this year. But at a moment of geopolitical tension, at a moment where it's very hard for diplomats to negotiate creatively simply because they're all on Skype, you also need civil society organizations to be throwing out more ambitious proposals for how to address issues like migration and how to bring in new voices like young people into UN debates. And we've seen a lot of activism from a lot of civil society organizations leading up to the UN 75 celebration. That includes the coalition called Together First, and actually it includes the work of the Stimson Center. And I would give a shout out to Richard Ponzio, who's done a huge amount of work thinking through ways to reform the UN after its 75th birthday. And, you know, we sometimes joke that UN reform is a Ponzio scheme, and I'm sure he's never heard that joke before. What I would say is that I don't think we're going to get big reforms in the UN in this 12-month period. We're not. The UN is going to be struggling, frankly, with the current situation and the pandemic and the humanitarian consequences of the pandemic. But what I do see is civil society organizations staking out some ambitions for reform that could come to fruition in a 5 to 10 year period. Reform moves slowly at the UN, but you know, groups like the Stimson Center really are contributing to that.
Thank you very much. And I quite agree with you that Richard does deserve a lot of credit for being just, you know, very persistent and amazingly productive in keeping these dialogues going. Dr. Ansari, so back to this question of what kinds of institutions do we need? We know that around the world, but certainly in the Middle East, regional institutions have not always thrived. They've gotten partway to their stated goals, but somehow they don't always get to the finish line. So I want to encourage you to give us your sense of, you know, is there something that could be done to build more successful alliances or partnerships among the regional states? You know, we don't have to, we could talk about formal security architecture, but even things that might be more informal and include civil society. Do you see any important ideas circulating that would address these problems of absence of trust and, you know, weak regional organizations?
Well, obviously, to build on what Richard was saying, I mean, at the end, any regional or international organization embodies the sum of the shortcomings of the states that form it. No regional or international organization is a standalone entity that can think alone. It's a big conglomerate of these states. Whatever problems they have are going to be transferred to this regional or international body. And in our region, especially in the Middle East, we have seen a lot of failure of regional bodies coming together, either the Morocco or the North African alliance that fell short of becoming a viable entity, the quasi-Arab union called the Declaration of Damascus, and of course the GCC and the Arab League, the only two entities still standing, only two regional entities still standing and functioning to some extent. However, I'm afraid this is the extent of their benefit at the moment, is that they are only standing there as organizations. And if you hear the discussions taking place in these organizations, what you find is that the discussion is not realistic. There's a lot of talk in these meetings and summits and a lot of declarations that come out that signify unity and cooperation and working together for the benefit of the region. That is never, sadly, or very seldom translated into action that would signify real cooperation in the region. One main issue there is that a unity amongst non-democratic states is quite difficult, because any kind of confederation or a cooperation between states on a higher level, such as a regional organization like the EU or another institution, basically demands some kind of release of power from the state itself to the regional entity that is being developed. In non-democratic settings, that is unthinkable that a non-democratic government would actually give up power for a higher organization. However, that said, I think there are a lot of, well, not a lot, but some good things that came out from regional cooperation in the GCC, as my colleague, Dr. Abdullah Baboud, who I seem to have been sharing the screen for a while now, in every webinar and such activity that takes place on Zoom. As he rightly said, there is a good standing commerce agreement between the countries that was disbanded because of the 2017 crisis, but there are also cultural, we all remember as children that there was a good cultural presence for the GCC in our curriculums, in schools, and in the media. That can be built upon when there is some kind of rational thinking in the region. And I remember at the past talk when Dr. Abdullah Baboud was talking exactly about this. The rationality of the regimes in the region is the main problem here. You can't even suggest that the disagreements between countries in the region are based in what what constitutes national interest. Sometimes it's just a personal, narcissistic view of politics. Therefore, any regional organization would need that kind of rational thinking from the states, from the leaders of these states, to be effective. However, just to point out to the other side of your question, what about the non-governmental side of multilateral cooperation or a cross-country collaboration in the region? I think the civil society in the GCC region and in the Middle East as a whole is quite weak when you compare it to the possibilities we have here in the region. So some of the richest states, the most prosperous states internationally are in that region, but you see a very weak and a very infant civil society in these countries. Even where you can see big civil society organizations, there are usually what we like to call governmental, non-governmental organizations. So NGOs that are basically supported and subsidized by government and run by figures who are closely associated with governments in the region. It doesn't allow for a real civil society to be prosperous, let alone have good cooperation with similar organizations or call for change in the region, positive change in the region. What we have seen, however, is that there was a different type of popular movement in the region that took place in some countries in the form of uprisings and social media outpours of cries for certain causes. That sometimes transcends the political sphere of the region to make it more viable to have action and to enact change. I think, especially in the GCC, if I can speak about my region, which I know most about, I think in our region there is a lot of possibility for civil society entities to be very active in bringing about more cooperation between states. However, that can only happen if we can find real rational politics to coincide with it. A minimal level of rational policies that are defined by the government in the region will allow for good civil society organizations to participate in change for good in the region. However, with the current climate, I think we are quite far away from such a very rainbow-like idea.
Thank you. But I have to say, having watched and visited the Middle East over many, many years, civil society is definitely much stronger than it used to be. People can speak more independently, and so I do think it's gradual change. You may not always see it day to day, but over time, I think the Middle East is moving in that direction. Kirsten, when you were in government, one of the ideas that was circulating was trying yet again to build a new security architecture. I don't know whether it was in response to the perceived dysfunction within the GCC, but it was this concept of a Middle East NATO or security alliance. I wonder if that idea is still viable in your new role outside of government. Do you still think it's the right way to go? Or do you think that the GCC is fixable from an American perspective? Is the better part of valor to try to fix the existing organization or to try to create something new?
I don't see them as actually you contradict. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think the GCC serves a unique purpose and needs to be preserved for the GCC's own interests. And the Middle East Strategic Alliance that would pull in the US and then countries like Egypt, Jordan, and hopefully in the future other countries is a wholly different construct. The Middle East Strategic Alliance was conceived as an alliance among and with Gulf nations, plus Jordan and Egypt and the US, to serve as a platform for creating a block of military capability and stability in the region that would far outweigh that of any individual country on its own. So it was originally envisioned with economic security and energy pillars underpinned by a governance structure. And these pillars were based on the logic chain that you cannot have stability without security and a functioning economy. And the economies of the region will be based on energy, whether oil, LNG, nuclear, solar, for the foreseeable future. But due to pressure from Saudi and the UAE, who originally sought a security-only agreement that included a NATO Article 5 collective security clause, the energy and economy pillars have been moved out of MESA to separate parallel efforts at state and energy, and the security pillar is now the focus of the plan. So it is still happening. There is a director at the NSC for MESA, and there has been since it was brought up and conceived. It's been quieter, and part of this is on the US. We had a lot of turnover within the government. People who were critical to its formation rotated out. Those who were not as familiar with the portfolio were messaging on it in ways that were a bit confusing. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, by insisting on this restructuring, really slowed down MESA probably by about a year, as we had to go back to the drawing board, re-engage with each of the countries and draft this new structure with these parallel lines of
Am I the only one who sees?
Yeah, no, I think she froze. And just to note, Ellen, we have lots of questions on the blockade, and I know we were going to get to those with the panelists.
Good. Okay, so Kirsten, I'm sorry, I think we should move on because we're running out of time to wrap up this portion of the discussion. So I'd like to turn to Dr. Babood for the very last question, and then Richard will take the baton from there. And again, it's a little bit on this, do you see opportunities for any structural institutional change in the region? How do you see, is the GCC, is it various planning councils, et cetera, are they still functioning? Is there more that needs to be done? Do you still believe that the GCC should be the principal institutional forum for the Gulf countries?
Yes, thank you. I think the GCC is still a very useful forum, and I think we should try and to preserve it as much as we can, at least for the GCC states. But I also want to broaden out a little bit, if I may, and to say that, look, we do not really have an all-encompassing, comprehensive, as well as inclusive regional organization. We live in a region that is not only inhabited by Arabs, and the GCC is only for the GCC states, the Arab League is only for the Arab states, the North African Union is also for the North African states, but we have also other countries around us. And trying to create a regional organization that is exclusive, it always has a problem. And I'm not saying that we should destroy what is there. I think we should build on what is there. and branch out a little bit more. Inclusive. We have other countries in the region that actually matters, and trying to keep them out has been problematic. And I think we should maybe think outside the box, or think without a box, if you like, since you asked this question, and create another structure that can be more encompassing and can be more comprehensive and as well as inclusive, that includes regional actors. And especially I'm here thinking about countries like Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and of course Israel as well. With of course there are issues there, but it's a regional country as well, where we can find, where all the countries in the region can feel that they have a formula, or they have platform where they can talk, and there is a conflict resolution mechanism, and there are some cooperations that are built into this. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, or we don't have to borrow existing structures, but we can build in or learn from other structures around the world. For example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, is a good example that we can at least learn some lessons from. And it's a very comprehensive organization, and it does not preclude the EU being part of this, or the EU is there. There is EFTA as well. There are lots of different other organizations in Europe, but this is an overall organization that encompasses other countries and other actors together. And I think we should think about something like this. And I just want to finish, if I may, Ellen. I don't think we should just wait for whether it's the United States give us another structure like MESA, which is not working, with all respect, because there is no confidence within the countries involved to start with. And it also it seems that it is directed against one, and it's not inclusive enough. That's on one hand. And then you have the Russian proposal as well. And then other powers are trying to impose structures on us. And now we have an Iranian proposal as well, the Hormuz proposal, and that includes getting rid of the United States, which is also not possible as well. The United States has a lot of interest there, and it should be part of anything that happens in the region. So I don't think we should wait for something to be parachuted down on us. It should come from within. However, that within is not happening, simply because we're really lacking at the moment decision-making rationality that doesn't exist. We may think that the Gulf states are 21st century states with all the modern infrastructure, but unfortunately, some of the ruling system is still kind of Middle Ages, and that is really what is hindering the region. And yes, there is civil society when it comes to people are being educated and so on, and they can talk more, etc. But it is not organized, and it's not allowed to form any kind of a civil society organization, because states still fear those societies. So we need a change in the mentality of the leadership, which unfortunately I don't see it happening now. I think it's going to take some time.
Well, thank you so much. And, a lot of good ideas, a few encouraging signs, but some very tough, and realistic analysis about what are some of the impediments to greater security cooperation and regional institution building. I want to thank the panelists. I thought it was a great conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to Richard now, who can now bring in the questions from the other participants in this meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen, and to all of our panelists for the rich and stimulating exchange. We're super thankful as well that Sheikha Alia can join us for this last 30-minute segment, hearing from all of you. Many questions have been coming in over the last hour. Greatly appreciate. We'll take an initial 3 and then hear briefly from our panelists, and then we'll have time for another round of the remaining questions. From USIP, Ms. Mona Yakubian writes, given issues and tensions in the, and I know that we had a third round of questions about the blockade. These first two speak to the blockade. Given the issues and tensions in the region, ranging from state to state tensions, as well as now permeating the societal level and the dysfunction evident in both regional institutions as well as the UN, what are some of the key short-term steps that can be taken to de-escalate tensions in the region, and by whom? Mr. Abdul Rahman Al Thani from Qatar adds to this question, how do you see the blockade after 3 years, and can a solution be found to end the blockade? Here in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Patrick Terros giving a US-related question on that same theme. Does the United States have a cohesive strategy in the Gulf to help end the blockade? Is it Secretary Pompeo's no negotiations till you cave ultimatum? Or is the signal to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, that we will not defend them unless the US is threatened? And then finally, I think a specific question for Richard Galwin on some of the big global themes that we brought up today. Seeing that the United States-China, the G2 standoff that you mentioned, is so cumbersome, is there no one to step up as a leader for the rest of the world, for UN 75 or other major global challenges? We're talking about the pandemic today, climate change, et cetera. What about the EU as a bloc, or China, India, anyone? Or are we back to bipolarity? So I'm encouraging brief answers from anybody who wishes to jump in. The first two groups of questions for all of our panelists, and the last one for Richard Gowan. Who would like to jump in first, please? And Sheikh Alia will give you the option if you wish to comment first. Oh, yes, you're unmuted.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm sorry, I was on the phone. So can you repeat the first two questions relating to the blockade?
Yes, there was different dimensions of it, but practical steps that can be taken in the near term. And the heart of our discussions, regional and global organizations, are the GCC and the UN working together. And whether it's the blockade or so many other issues in the Middle East, Yemen, Syria come to mind, how can these important institutions and their collaboration together be enhanced?
Thank you, Richard. I mean, as I mentioned in my keynote remarks, it's, in Qatar, we believe in the important role played by, regional organizations. And we believe in the heart and the soul of the UN Charter, where there is importance for regions to cooperate and to work together. And the impact of COVID-19 is an excellent example for us, where the pandemic has affected every country equally, whether they are rich or poor, whether they are big or small. We're all affected equally in terms of the impact of it on different aspects of our daily lives. So it's again another example for us to enhance the whole idea of multilateralism, international cooperation, working with each other, but working with each other by respecting each other and by having the sense of trust and building confidence. And we cannot do that by disrespecting, human rights, international law, the means of justice. We can't go by doing our daily business by not, making sure we are really safeguarding the principles and values that enshrined in the UN Charter by the founders of the United Nations. And again, the UN 75th anniversary is another opportunity for us to really reinforce that. I mean, in the Gulf, of course, as I mentioned, I gave a very lively example. Dr. Majid Al-Ansari as well shed light on the regional aspects of the GCC crisis. That is basically based on a baseless crisis, an unnecessary crisis added to the plate in the Arab region. I mean, the region has already enough issues to deal with. But again, our neighbors, unfortunately, you know, they've lost a sense of direction when it comes to focusing on what is important. I mean, now with the impact of COVID, with, you know, we're overwhelmed with many issues that needs to bring us together. The GCC used to function, you know. I mean, if you recall, in the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2010, the GCC was seen within the Arab region as the most functioning unit within the Arab League. But now, I mean, you see it fragmented. And why? Because of a baseless crisis that created by three GCC countries against the state of Qatar. So again, it's all about realizing the importance of working together. You know, the need to work at the global level, regional level, and the, you know, the UN cannot function without the will of member states. The element of the role of civil society, again, I mean, this is something we believe in Qatar. I mean, we believe in the role of civil society, the role of media, but again, you know, the mindset in the region is not going along. But we're going forward. I mean, you know, the aspects of the GCC crisis has to do with how Qatar is progressing on human rights, on the freedom of speech, on the you know, providing a platform for the media. I think this is the GCC crisis is as well all about that. You know, these countries not wanting us to take the step forward, because change, as I said, you know, change is coming, whether, you know, our neighbors like it or not. It is coming. We're realistic people, you know, in Qatar. We're very pragmatic in terms of change, and I think we've managed to do it through investing in education, investing in infrastructure, because it's the time for us to go along with the changes. We cannot just stay in the past and think that, you know, we are fine being where we are. I think it's a matter of time, and where our perspective will go forward in the whole of the region. But again, you know, we're very much we're happy with the relationship we have within the GCC with Kuwait and Oman. We believe that we share with Kuwait and Oman the same mindset, and I'm sure at one step at a time we will be able to see the region developing if our region, the blockading countries specifically, really realize that change is inevitable and we have to go forward.
Thank you, Sheikh Ali, for that very comprehensive response. I'm going to ask Kirsten to come in here. We're glad to have you back if you wanted to finish the point you were making before your screen froze. But most importantly, Ambassador Terros had a specific element of that same question about some of the statements that Secretary of State Pompeo has been making in relation to the Gulf crisis.
Sure. From what I understand, from what I read of Patrick's question before I was kicked off, sorry, we're having power surges out here for some reason. His question was about whether there is a U.S. strategy for the Gulf and the like. And I'll be happy to touch on the blockade if you'd like after that. But just focusing on what Patrick was asking, you know, MESA was actually one of our big pillars of the strategy for the Gulf, and that's why it was being pursued so intently and still stays a priority. But you know, let me just point out that some of the choices by Gulf countries have forced the U.S. to alter its strategy of kind of strengthening engagement to one of great powers competition because of some of their own decisions. So when we watch things like strengthening ties with China, when we watch things like back channel talks to Iran that don't involve us, when we watch things like flirtations with Russian weapons platforms purchases, or coordination with Russia in Syria or in Libya, you know, it means that we have to sort of backpedal and realign. And so I would ask the Gulf to kind of take a look at its own decisions when it says, why is the US not as engaged? They're forcing us to refocus. And if some of that behavior changed a bit, then they'd find us to be more greatly back on track with our original Gulf strategy of full engagement, of full partnership, of interoperability, of trade relations, of networking on energy, you know, all these good things. I'll leave it at that, but I'll be happy to talk about either Mona Yakubian's question or the blockade per your direction as you go through panelists. Wonderful.
No, I'm going to encourage all of the panelists who wish to speak to some of those opening round questions. Seeing we're near time, though, I want to give you an option. I'm going to go through the remaining questions now and then turn to Dr. Al-Ansari, Dr. Babood, of course, Richard on that opening question that I shared, and hear from everybody one last time. I think at that point, we'll be getting close to 12:30. So the last round of questions, Akio Miyajima asks, if US withdrawal from the Middle East is inevitable and the US-China tensions remain growing, how best do you think the Gulf states should protect and promote their security and prosperity? Dr. Peter Middlebrook, who knows where he's based these days, but normally in the Gulf as well as in Europe and the US, the population of East Africa is set to reach 1.58 billion by 2100. The question is how, in the absence of a cohesive GCC and given lack of progress on Yemen, how can common concern over the Red Sea be used as a confidence building measure? John Carley here in the United States, it's interesting to see the trust rising so prominently when it was the subject of the most trust paragraph in the declaration, the UN 75 declaration, I believe he's referring to as a contentious issue. What would trust look like? How can it be? How can we be accountable for trust? Do we have an accurate valuation for trust in our processes of multilateral cooperation? In particular, I think he's speaking to the United Nations. Three final questions. Jassim from Bahrain, he asks, do you think that the Trump administration has failed to demonstrate leadership in resolving the Gulf crisis? Waldemar Indal, could be from Scandinavia, is there a future for the Arab League? And finally, a former colleague of mine from the Hague Institute, Anya Mir, she's currently professor at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Her question to Richard Gowan or Dr. Al-Ansari is, to what extent does the non-democratic character of most UN member states and almost all Middle East countries play into the fact that transnational solutions cannot be found? Lots of questions. I encourage, as we've advised our panelists before, please take just one question, at most two, if you're going to be brief. And we'd love to hear from each of you before we finish up in the next 15 or so minutes. Dr. Al-Ansari or Dr. Babur, who would like to jump in first? Please, Dr. Al-Ansari.
Okay, a lot of questions there, and I'll try to give an over-encompassing answer to at least touch upon most of these concerns. Just to give a general answer towards what's happening with the Gulf crisis, I think the main development that's been taking place now is that there are some more diplomatic back and forth between the Gulf states. We have seen some words, coming out from Kuwait, for example, and Oman, talking positively about a resolution. However, there is no ecosystem for this resolution. We have seen a lot of heightened media animosity between the two parties in the crisis, and there doesn't seem to be, a good foundation for any kind of resolution at the moment. Regarding the U.S. role in this crisis, I think there's a dependency internationally on the U.S., but especially here in the Gulf. Since the Carter Declaration, I think there was a very clear idea that the U.S. will be the backbone of security in the Gulf region. However, that kind of transformed also not only for the U.S. to be security guarantor for the GCC, but also the mediator between various GCC states. And I think American policy has always been in bilateral dealings with the GCC countries. I don't think there has been ever a coherent policy of the US towards the GCC in general. And I think it's a big mistake to assume that there is one, because since its inception, the relationships between the GCC countries and the US have been carefully structured upon individual countries' needs and priorities, with the US not as a whole, even though the rhetoric around Iran and protecting the GCC and so on takes on a lot of a GCC perspective. The actual relations between these countries and the US has always been based on bilateral relations and not as a group. And there is no coherent GCC policy to work with anyway. You can't say that Saudi Arabia has the same foreign policy and geopolitical view as Qatar, for example, to be considered by the US to be one entity in dealing with. And therefore, when you say when our colleague Kristen, for example, said that the Gulf countries should review their positions when they have some dealings with Russia. This is talking about only probably 2 countries in the GCC, while the other countries have a different position altogether in these situations. Just to end and to allow my colleagues to comment more, the last questions on the non-democratic nature of most states in the UN. I think this is a pivotal point in us evaluating the UN or any other international or regional entity. As I said before, it's the sum of the issues that are happening within the states themselves. You cannot talk about the UN as this father-like figure to the world. The UN is a table where the world sits at. When there is a disease that some states in the world suffer from, it will be brought to the table in the same manner. And therefore, I think unless we have a new wave of democratic change in the world, it's not realistic to think that any reform in the UN will make the UN even more useful in solving issues internationally and advancing international causes. The only way for these organizations to go forward and to become better and to become stronger internationally is for the individual members to enact change within themselves before bringing it to the UN.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Ansari. As I turn to Dr. Babour, I kindly request all the remaining interventions kindly keep to 2 minutes or less. Dr. Babour.
Yes, thank you, Richard. I think there is one other thing that we should think about, and that is not only in the region, but also globally. We have to respect the differences between us. And I think when we do that, we will try to understand where people come from or how do they think. If you were in Saudi Arabia, you think differently if you were from Qatar or from Kuwait or from Oman or United Arab Emirates. In terms of your strategic calculations, etc. And I think this applies to everybody else. And it's also how to manage these differences through some kind of rational dialogue that can, can reconcile these differences and understand each other. I think that is lacking. And I think what we are seeing now is that there are regional countries that want to kind of dominate the agenda, and they're seeking for some kind of a hegemonic leadership in the region, which I think it's tried and tested, and it has failed throughout history, and no one can ever dominate the region. Yes, there are countries that are larger and they are respected, but you cannot be a hegemonic power in the region. And I think this is what we are seeing, that there is bit of hegemonic leadership, and each one is trying to kind of bully the others. And that is not really something that's going to help the region. The other thing that I would also wanted to add is that, as I said, conflicts do happen between states, and misunderstandings does happen, and it should be resolved through some dialogue, etc. Now, if the blockading country had an issue with Qatar, and even if you assume that they had an issue with Qatar, the proper thing would have been is to go back to the GCC and bring it up at the GCC Council and discuss it, or at least when go back to the Riyadh Agreement that was signed in 2014 and say this is what we have agreed, and this is where you have failed, and how can we reconcile that, instead of hacking and making fake news, which is actually absurd, and to do that. So I think we should change that kind of mentality. Yes, we expect that there are going to be differences between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Oman, etc. This is natural to happen, but it should be managed in a way that we can reconcile differences. And if you were asking me, what do we do now? I think that they have the blockading countries have escalated so much that has made it so difficult to reconcile now. And it's not going to be easy, but I think it's not impossible. And finally, they will have to come back together. And I think one thing that they could start to do at the moment is to reduce this media tension, as it were. And one other thing is perhaps allow Qatar to to use the airspace. That will be a kind of a goodwill thing that they could do. And I think then they can start building on that. And I will end up by saying, Richard, if I may, that the region is now not only facing the epidemic, which we don't know how long this is going to continue, and the cost of that, but it's also facing the short fall in the oil prices. And also the triple effect of added to that is, of course, of their investments globally. So the IMF had already warned the Gulf states that in 15 years they're going to be bankrupt almost. The Institute of International Finance, the IIF, has just also warned the Gulf states that and getting involved in sideline conflicts that are costing them fortune and costing the people and destroying the economies and of course wasting their resources is not helpful to anybody, and there is no end game to it, and there is no benefit to anybody. And I think anybody who's benefited is the outsiders, but not the people in the Gulf. That kind of rationality does not exist, and we need to the United States and the international partners need to talk to our leaders and to say, look, this is not rational what you're doing. You're really hurting yourself more than anybody else, and you're not getting anything out of it. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Mahbub. As our colleague, Richard Gowan, responds to two of the questions, including the last one from our colleague, Dr. Anya Mir out in Bishkek, I will allow, but extremely brief, final interventions from Sheikha Alia, anybody else who wishes to talk after Richard. Richard, over to you.
Okay, the first question was, given China-US tensions, and given a lack of leadership, I think especially from the US, in the UN system, can others lead? I would make a couple of points. I think that what the COVID-19 crisis has shown us is, yes, the US is not leading, but actually China hasn't emerged as a really credible alternative leader at the UN either. It's offered money to the UN, but it hasn't tabled a strategic vision for dealing with the pandemic that's fully compelling. Can anyone else lead? Yes, I think that we have seen France and the European institutions, for example, stake out an important leadership role on the vaccine issue. And it was the European Union that hustled a resolution on the investigation of the origins of COVID through the World Health Assembly. I think Joris, the guy who asked the question, also mentioned that in the WTO, we begin to see the EU playing a leadership role in terms of keeping the organization going, while the US has blocked the WTO disputes resolution mechanism. So in certain areas, and specifically areas where trade, money, regulations matter, I believe that the EU is a potential alternative leader. I would also say that there are many other countries in the UN system, ranging from Mexico to Qatar to Singapore, that have staked out leadership roles on specific issues and can move the ball forward on particular initiatives. But in certain forums, especially the Security Council, where the veto is crucial, it is very, very hard to get around the G2 problem. And I suspect we'll see bits of the UN grow less effective, but some actors will be able to keep on driving initiatives in those areas where there aren't so many sort of veto blocks and so forth to deal with. Does democracy matter in this game? Yes, it does. We're seeing China and Russia in particular attempting to roll back the role of civil society in UN debates. And there are quite big questions between more authoritarian and more democratic countries about exactly how much the UN should listen to civil society. But I would say that we sometimes overestimate democracy as a key identifying factor in UN discussions. And I think that we forget that development and different countries' attitudes to development can be more important. And I would say that looking to the second half of 2020 and into 2021, I think one big debate we're going to see in the UN system that we haven't touched on yet is about the economic repercussions of COVID-19, and to what extent developing countries and poor countries can expect development aid from advanced economies to get them through the fallout of the COVID recession. And I think that could actually turn into a very nasty discussion at the UN, but it's not the topic for today. On that note, I will wrap up simply by saying that this has been a great discussion, and Crisis Group is very happy to have been a small part of this discussion. So thank you to Stimson and thank you to Qatar for inviting us into the tent for these talks.
Thank you, Richard. You've been a great partner on this program today. Sheikha Alia or anybody else wish to make any final comments?
Richard, can I jump in really quickly and just reassure people that there is a renewed effort on the part of the U.S. administration right now to resolve the rift? It was a big push in 2018. It took a back seat in 2019, but that right now there is a major new effort on the part of the administration to resolve it, and some tough conversations are happening with Gulf leaders right now, mostly focused on the air blockade. If people are interested, we can talk more about it, but I know we're trying to close up, so I just want people to know that is happening.
Appreciate it. And the final word goes to Sheikha Alia.
Richard, thank you so much. I just really want to thank everyone. This is an important conversation, timely, comes in a very important time where we deliberate here in New York many aspects of the relevance of the United Nations today, with facing all of these new and emerging challenges, these obstacles. Some countries, specific countries, I mean, the blockade is a great example for that, rifting from the principles enriched by the founders of the United Nations. So again, we need to continue working together on reinvigorating the meaning of multilateralism, and this is the UN 75th anniversary is really that opportunity to do that. And again, the impact of COVID-19 as well is a moment for us to realize that we cannot live we can't go about our lives without working together to build back better. This is the phrase that we use on a daily basis now in New York, building back better for everyone and with everyone. So this is what I wanted to end this event with.
Thank you, Sheikha Alia. Before we conclude, let me extend a special thanks to the team behind the scenes that's helped to pull together today's program and get the word out to all of you around the world. My Stimson colleagues are also very thankful, as I noted earlier, to Richard, our co-sponsor, the International Crisis Group, as well as you just heard from our keynote speaker, Sheikha Alia, and our skillful roundtable moderator and an entire group of panelists. So Ellen Leifson, Dr. Majid Al-Ansari, Dr. Abdullah Baboud, where it's past 12 midnight out in Singapore, where you're based these days, Kirsten Fontaine-Rose, and once again, Richard Gowan. If we were all together in a room, there would be lots of applause. Finally, we're thankful to all of you for joining us these past 90 minutes and for your many incisive questions. Sorry if we didn't get to others that came in the last few minutes. As the UN prepares to mark the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Charter later this month on the 26th, and the Gulf Cooperation Council commemorates its 40th anniversary in a year's time, the quest for global security and justice continues. So we look forward to future opportunities like this to contribute new thinking and ways to make our global and regional governing institutions more inclusive, effective, and just. Thank you once again, and of course, stay well and safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.